All right, so let's take physicalism to one of its important logical conclusions. So remember, physicalism is the theory that reality is constituted entirely by things that are subject to the physical laws of the universe, material things like matter, energy. These are the things that exist. And these are the only things that exist, according to physicalism. Physicalism excludes non-physical things from reality. Minds, souls, spirits, God. These are things that do not exist. All right. So if that's the case, if the physicalists are right, then we might end up at the theory of determinism. Determinism says that every single thing that occurs is caused to occur. And what causes it to occur is the total set of circumstances that existed the moment before the event we witnessed. So you have a chain of events occurring, and that chain of events leads to a particular set of circumstances that exist at a given moment in time, and then that set of circumstances is what compels whatever event is that we just observed. The determinist is going to say nothing occurs without a cause. You might not know what the cause is, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a cause. Nothing just happens. Everything that happens was caused to happen. So if you don't know what caused it, you can go looking for the cause, and you may find it, and even if you don't, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because everything that occurs was caused to occur. Now, they're going to extend this into your brain, and they're going to say, those choices you make, those are really just the result of the sum total of our biological, psychological, and environmental circumstances. Okay? So this is what the determinist is saying. The physicalists are right. The only things that exist are physical things. You have a brain. That brain is chugging along, and at any given moment is experiencing some state. There's some brain state. Particular neurons are firing, some are not firing. There's chemicals going on. And the determinist is going to say, when you make a choice, that's an event. And that event is occurring in the way that it occurs because of the way that your brain is set up, or the state of your brain, the moment you make that decision. Okay? So kind of what they're saying is, you don't actually make choices. You think you have free will. You feel like you have free will, but really, you don't. Free will is a non-physical thing that does not exist, because the only things that exist are physical things like brains, and the things that cause events in these physical things are physical properties, the total state of your brain. So the physicalist and the determinist are going to say, I know you feel free, but that ain't the same thing as being free. It's an illusion, this thing called free will that you think you have. You might think back, there's a similar kind of argument that Parmenides and Zeno were making about the structure of reality, thousands of years ago. We talked about this earlier, that they're making the claim that you think reality includes things like change and motion. But those are just illusions. We know that this is the way reality appears to you, but they claimed, logically, that can't be the way reality actually is. And the physicalists and determinists are doing kind of the same thing. They're saying, here's what we think exists, and here are the properties of the things that exist, these physical things, and here's how events unfold. And events unfold in a logically necessary way that excludes your free will. You think you have it, but you really don't. Okay? So the determinists have a pretty good argument here to make. The argument goes something like this. Every event, without exception, is causally determined by prior events. Human thoughts, choices, and actions are events. Therefore, human thoughts, choices, and actions are, without exception, causally determined by prior events. Okay? So no free will for you. No free will for me either. Okay? And what's important about the determinists, physicalists, is there's no exception here. Everything, every single choice you have made, every single thought you have had was caused to happen by physical events. You didn't choose it. It kind of chose you. And the determinists are going to point to some pretty good evidence that their arguments are right. The first thing they might point out is advertising. Think about what advertisers do. They don't hire, an advertising agency doesn't just hire people who are good at graphics or people who are good writers. They hire psychologists. right? There has been for a decade or so a controversy about whether or not people who are licensed child psychologists should lose their licenses if they take a job for an ad agency or a company where their task is to develop strategies for manipulating children into buying a company's product, right? So if a child psychologist comes into an ad agency, they'll say, I know exactly how to get kids to pester mom and dad to buy that cereal. In other words, I know what kind of event, what set of circumstances to expose that child to that will cause a change in their behavior that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. In other words, cause them to, quote unquote, make the choice to beg for a particular box of cereal. And again, so advertisers spend billions and billions and billions of dollars a year on manipulating people in just this way, on creating a set of circumstances that will cause particular kinds of behavior in potential customers, okay? And you might think about how things like Match.com work, right? It's kind of crazy. My sister's been married for nearly 20 years to a person she met on Match.com. One of our former college presidents met her husband on Match.com. You probably know people who've met folks on Match.com. And Match.com and the Determinists, the Physicalists are going to say, like, there's no secret here, folks, on how we do this. All I need is enough information about an individual person at a given moment in time. What are their values? What are their goals? What are their desires? What are their fears? I'm going to create a laundry list of information about a particular person and where they're at this moment. And then algorithmically, I can very easily figure out who they will choose to be partnered with if we expose them to this kind of person, right? So they're really doing kind of the similar thing as the advertisers are doing. If you watch like that show Mindhunter, which is a good show, by the way, really good for a lot of reasons. Anyway, it sort of demonstrates how profiling came about as a discipline within the FBI in I think it was the 70s or 80s. And if you have ever paid attention to what these criminal profilers do, it's really wild, man. They'll like come on a crime scene and they'll see like, oh, there's somebody cut this window screen with a razor at this particular angle. And then it's like, okay, I know it's a white guy who drives an orange 1968 Volkswagen Bug with a dent on the right front bumper. It's like, you got all that from the cut of the angle? And I'm exaggerating, of course. But those FBI this is what they're doing. They're looking at a set of circumstances that has been created by a criminal, and then they're sort of walking it back and saying, what kinds of circumstances in a person's brain would have led to this kinds of behavior? And what is likely to be the future kinds of types of behavior by this particular person? And it's extremely effective, right? So the determinists, the physicalists, they're going to point to things like this. And they're going to say, yes, I know you have this sort of romantic attachment to your free will, but there really is a better case to be made, they claim, that everything's just determined and you're along for the ride. All right, so where does this go? Importantly, it's going to lead us to some decisions that we have to make about moral responsibility, okay? And here's what we have to consider. Maybe we're determined, okay? We could agree with that. If we're determined, then we would lack the freedom necessary to be morally responsible, okay? Or we do have the freedom necessary to be morally responsible. Now, what I mean by morally responsible here is not like legally liable. I mean, when we think about moral responsibility, we're thinking about I'm gonna condemn a person for their actions. I'm gonna blame them, or I'm gonna praise them, I'll reward them, or I'm gonna punish them, right? So we're talking about this idea that individual people have a sort of value attached to the judgments that they make and the actions they take, and we can fairly assess the quality of those actions for their moral value. Okay, now we can't have all three of these, right? We can only pick two. So you got to figure out which two you want to pick. If you choose number 1 and 2, you might be what's called a hard determinist. Hard determinist is going to say, we are determined, just like the physicalists sort of set up for us. And if we're determined, I lack the freedom necessary for you to blame or praise me for anything because I didn't actually do it. It was done. and I was kind of along for the ride. Okay? But if you take options number 2 and 3, you might be a libertarian, which we're going to look at here soon. And libertarianism in this case doesn't mean like political libertarianism of Rand Paul. It just means that you actually possess the metaphysical freedom, right? That this thing exists in reality called free will that allows you to make your own choices. And because they're your own choices, you can be held morally responsible for those choices, okay? So both the hard determinist and the libertarian are what we would call incompatibilists. In other words, they both agree that if we are determined, then we lack the freedom necessary to be morally responsible. They both agree with that. But where they disagree is the libertarian says, I agree that if that were the case, we would lack the freedom necessary to be morally responsible. I just don't think that's the case. I don't think we are determined. I think, I reject this first premise up here. I think we do have free will. And so the idea of determinism and moral responsibility being compatible with one another doesn't make any sense to me. How could you hold somebody responsible for something that they couldn't help doing? Fortunately, the libertarian says, we aren't determined. Okay? But the hard determinists say, we are determined, therefore moral responsibility is incompatible with determinism. Now, you could also take the position of 1 and 3, in which case you'd be called a compatibilist. And a compatibilist is going to say, I agree you are determined. And I agree that every action that occurs is determined. So I agree with premise number 1. Nonetheless, I think that the actions that were determined, that you experienced, are actions you own because it was your experience. And so to the degree that, to the degree we understand the actions you took and what the motivations you were, and all of this was determined, we can hold you morally responsible for these events that you participated in, even though you couldn't have helped, or you couldn't have refrained from participating in them because everything's determined. All right, so you want to give some serious consideration to physicalism and its logical conclusion in determinism, and to ask yourself, does this seem like an adequate or even effective way to think about the structure of reality? Should you be a physicalist? Should you be a determinist? Or do you see flaws in the determinist and physicalists' arguments that you think justifies maybe looking elsewhere?